Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the podcast series, Careers in Science. My name is Sean Hughes, chemistry teacher at John Abbott College, and I started this series to shed light on the many opportunities that await high school and CEGEP and university students that are interested in pursuing jobs in science. And again, thinking back on my own experience in school, I always had an interest in science, but apart from the usual suspect jobs of a lawyer or a doctor, an engineer, I really wasn't sure what I could do with a science education. And so I really hope that this series of podcasts can help highlight for you the wonderful opportunities that await you should you elect to pursue science and put a spotlight on the many jobs that you may not have even ever thought of. My guest today is my cousin, Caitlin Dever. Caitlin is a material scientist and is currently employed at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories in Chalk River, Ontario. Prior to working there, Caitlin earned her master's degree at McMaster University, investigating the electrochemical properties of galvanized coatings on steels. And Caitlin obtained a Bachelor's of Engineering also at McMaster University, specifically in material science and engineering. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you, Sean, for the very kind introduction.
I'm happy to get to talk to you about this because we'll touch upon this later. It's really nice to see women pursuing their career in a field that is traditionally not attracting a lot of women.
Yeah, definitely. So for me personally, it's something that I'm really excited to be able to talk about because I know that there are a lot of women and women that I grew up with that were essentially steered away from STEM fields just because they felt that it wasn't a role that they could actually get into.
I mean, I'm going to jump right into it here, Caitlin. Thinking back to school, I mean, when did you start getting an interest in science?
I really think that I was interested in science from as far back as I can remember. And originally, my career goal was always to be a neurosurgeon. And I remember just kind of trying to go for that right from the get go of that. I want to be a doctor. I want to get right into those ER situations. I want to be helping people in whatever way I possibly can.
What changed along the way then?
Big thing was money and just overall time of schooling. But really, what kind of worked out for me was that I was already in high school planning on pursuing a science degree. So that meant that I was taking those English courses, those advanced functions courses, all the science courses that I could possibly take. So it really set me up well for university. So when I was applying for university, I was really trying to think of, okay, well, I know I want to get into med school at some point. And my mom was like, are you sure that you really want to get into med school? Because there are a lot of other opportunities that are available for you. And I kind of said, well, yeah, med school has always been my goal. And she said, okay, I understand. But I saw that McMaster University was actually hosting a 2-day camp on engineering. And she said, I thought that that was something you might actually be interested in doing. And I kind of said, okay, I have no problem with that. I had never even considered engineering at that point. So I went, I did this camp, and I found out that it was actually something that I really enjoyed and was really interested in doing. So I ended up applying out to engineering programs as well as programs that were catered towards medical studies. And I didn't end up actually accepting my engineering program offer to McMaster University until the very last day for acceptances because I could not make up my mind.
Funny that your change in career came early on when you were applying to university. I could speak for myself and again, my own experience. And I mentioned this in previous discussion with Dr. Hannah Zook in our first episode in the podcast series was that I actually have a degree in biology. My bachelor's is in biology. And I remember what started to change for me, this desire to go to med school, was one chance encounters with other professors in chemistry, and it kind of got me interested in other fields that I didn't think existed at the time. But two was that I was taking an animal physiology class, and I had to do surgery on a rat. One was a hysterectomy to basically take out the uterus from a female rat and then sew it back up, and it had to live. And then we were
Wow.
going to do some tests on that. To do the same thing on a male rat, we had to take out its testes. Same thing, sew it up, and it had to live. And then we were going to go do experiments with it. And I could not make the first incision. I just couldn't do it. So here's this anesthetized rat just lying down on my workbench. And I'm just staring at it with its paws all up in the air. And I said, God, I can't do this. I can't do this. And I started thinking, like, what's med school going to be like? And I just decided, you know what? It just wasn't for me. So it's very different experience. Mine was obviously more visceral, but you early on got exposure to something that you didn't know it really existed, didn't even enter your mind, but then it kind of set you on your new path.
Yeah, exactly. So I am really thankful for being able to have that opportunity. And I also think too that it is really important for someone like you, for instance, that you did end up realizing, I'm not sure that this is for me, and that you changed your career path. Because a lot of times once people get into university, there is that sunk cost fallacy and they just don't want to change.
Tell me about your experiences in the bachelor's program in engineering at McMaster.
I had always liked school, so for me, I loved it. I thought that my courses were all really interesting. First year at McMaster in engineering, you start off in a general first year, so you get to kind of dabble in a lot of different areas. So initially, I had thought that I wanted to be a chemical engineer. And then in doing that very broad first year undergraduate, we had a materials course. And that was when I kind of sat down and went, yes, that is 100% what I want to do. When it came time to choosing what we wanted to do for second year, it was a no-brainer. I went right into materials engineering, and I got to do all of the courses and all the hands-on work, all the laboratory stuff that I really wanted to do. And it was things that I had never even thought that I wanted to do in high school.
At what point did you decide? At some point, you started entertaining the idea of doing a master's. When did that enter the game plan, if you will?
The time that I really kind of started considering my master's was actually when I ended up approaching one of my master's supervisors, Dr. McDermott, in looking for a summer research position. That ended up working out really well for me because it allowed me to do some research that actually focused on aerospace. And I remember doing that and thinking, wow, this is really cool. I love getting to research these things. I like getting to work on the new techniques and figuring out how is the best way to test things, how to come up with new and novel materials to be using for these. And Dr. McDermott was also kind enough to send me out to a conference while I was working for him. And that was where I got to connect with a lot of really great people. And I was able to really see that this was something that I wanted to do. Because I had that intimate relationship as well already with Dr. McDermott, he just automatically offered me that master's position and said, I want you to come and do your master's with me. So it was just kind of right there, and the pieces just kind of lined up for me.
What was different about your experience as a bachelor student versus when you moved into master's domain? Obviously, you were doing some sort of research early on in your bachelor's. And I have to say for listeners, I cannot stress more how valuable that learning experience is if you can get yourself into somebody's lab and do work. If you can even find a summer internship somewhere and just to get that exposure to the lab, because it really does change your mindset about science and how to approach science. But there are definitely differences between a bachelor's and what you experience there and a master's.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that that summer internship was really the turning point in my career because before that, I was just, I'm going to do my 4 years in engineering. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to go right into industry. The differences between undergrad and graduate, of course, are that in the graduate studies, you're actually kind of leading your own research. My two co-supervisors, Dr. McDermott and Dr. Kish, were very great supervisors to have because they would let you kind of go ahead, start to dabble in things, but they were always there to answer your questions, but they didn't spoon feed you the answers. So that was really what got me interested, especially even more into that research side, because I was the one kind of deciding, okay, so I did this test, I'm seeing these results, I want to know more about this. And it allowed me to kind of develop different test plans and have something that was a little bit more flexible as opposed to something that was very rigid. And there weren't any real concrete answers. Whereas in your undergraduate, of course, when you're doing a lab, it's a tried and true lab that everyone has done over and over and over. So you already know what your answer should be at the end of it.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up, and I'm involved in a project right now where we're looking at exactly that, the undergraduate laboratory experience in science. And oftentimes, one of the problems with undergraduate laboratories is that they're a lot like verification labs as opposed to real scientific inquiry, where you are actually tackling a problem and that you've got to ask questions about what it is you're doing and think about your experimental direction, think about a hypothesis, right? All that to say that when I did make the leap to graduate school, I had a hard time sort of reconciling that because I was used to going into a lab and there was a quote right answer. And then I would get that right answer, and I'd have this belief that I was really good in the lab. But when I started graduate school and I was working on novel research, this is the first time where you don't know what the answer is, or even if that your hypothesis is correct and you're going in the right direction. I found that very tough. It took me a long time to kind of get over that and to start thinking about things in a more open way and sort of accepting that there isn't necessarily a right answer at the end of this tunnel.
Yeah, definitely. I know too that in my master's there were some tests that I was running that they ran for 40 hours. And one of the things you have to understand is that sometimes you can set everything up right and your test is going to fail. So I went and I checked up on my test an hour before it was supposed to end, 39 hours into the test, and there was a power failure. So I lost all of that data.
Oh my God. You see, I'm
And
thankful that the stuff I did was largely computer simulation. And
yes,
so if it crashed, well, it crashed. I had my moments of that too, but it was easy to start back up again.
yeah,
I
that
can't
was an
imagine what it
entire
was like.
sample wasted. You kind of have to be a little bit resilient in these things because sometimes things just don't go according to plan.
On that note, could you speak to some of the resilience that's required to get through a master's program?
There are differences between the different types of masters that you can do. You can do the masters of science and you can do the masters of applied science. So mine was an applied science master's, which allowed me to get into the research labs, whereas your master's of science is more of a learning based kind of master's. At the same time that I was doing all of these tests, I also had to juggle in coursework as well. So I was able to pick and choose certain types of courses. And I also wanted to try to make sure that those courses were not only relevant to what I was doing in my master's, but also would be beneficial for me to have in whatever career I ended up choosing after the master's. You also have to think about the fact that while you're in your master's, as I said, tests don't always go according to plan. So you have to sit there and go, okay, why didn't this work? And you have to be the person to solve it. I don't think that it's really that beneficial to go up to your master's supervisor and say, yeah, my test didn't work. Well, really, you should be trying to figure out by yourself why first, and then coming up with a solution for that. And depending too on your master supervisor, some of them might want you to write papers, some of them might want you to go out to conferences and present your research. So a lot of it too is making sure that you are able to take in that constructive criticism, becoming confident in yourself, knowing that you know your research and being able to go and present it not only well and effectively, but knowing too that you want to do a good job because it not only reflects on you, but it also reflects on your supervisors as well.
What made you decide to stop at the master's and jump into the workforce as opposed to sticking around and doing a PhD?
Yeah, so I was offered a couple of options. Like the main one being that Dr. McDermott had offered me to fast track into that PhD, like you said. One of the things that I had thought about that too was, okay, so that's kind of beneficial because instead of me doing my master's in 2 years, my PhD in 4 years, I can get a PhD in a total of 4 years as opposed to 6 years. So you shave off 2 years of your schooling. But at the same time, the way that I looked at it too was, okay, so I already did my undergraduate at McMaster. I just did my master's at McMaster. Now I'm also technically going to be doing my PhD as well at McMaster. And a part of me was a little bit concerned that by showing that I had only worked at one university, that I wasn't open to change. And then, of course, too, when you do that fast track, you only have one research topic that you focus on. And that for me would have been focusing on those press hardened steels, which is by no means a poor decision, but it was something that I kind of had to take a step back and go, is this where I want to get streamlined into? Or do I want to quit at my master's and be able to jump into any research position? Because from what I've seen in my own experience is that if you go and you get your PhD in even say casting, for instance, then your research later on when you go into industry becomes in casting, and that's your entire role. Whereas when you go from your master's, and it can be at any topic, into industry afterwards, you're a little bit more seen as someone who can be trained in that industrial role. So they will start to show you different areas. So for instance, I feel as though if I had gone and done my PhD in the current role that I was doing, I would not have been offered the position that I was offered at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, because that was something that was strictly focusing on the automotive side of things, which is very far removed from the nuclear side of things.
So perfect segue. After your master's, you ended up at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. What's your job there and what does it entail? And what's the day-to-day like on the job?
I'm going to start this off by saying that I absolutely love my job. And I know that that's not one of the most common things that people can say about their jobs, but I really
That's
do like
great. It's a
mine.
great thing to say about your job.
Yeah. So I think that it's something that I wish that more people would focus on, that they do find a job that they really enjoy. So I'm a materials scientist, specifically is that I'm a research scientist at Canadian Nuclear Labs. So in this role, I'm often proposing novel research ideas for future work, or I'm also trying to solve problems that the industry is currently facing. So in this role, I'm able to come up with test plans, figuring out how we're going to actually test the ideas that I have come up with. I am able to, for instance, oversee some of the work that we have carrying out in hot cells, which allows us to actually handle ex-service material. So I'm able to also use advanced microscopy techniques. We are also able to use micromechanical testing that's available to us, such as nanoannotation, using the focused ion beam or the FIB to make out nanoscale tensile samples, so that way we're not only able to reduce the total amount of active material that we're working with, but we're also able to see how the material performs on a grain-to-grain basis. So the main part of my job especially is assessing the effects of irradiation on the mechanical properties, corrosion properties, and the deuterium ingress rates into varying reactor components. The day-to-day on my job is always change. That is one of the other things that I really enjoy about my job, is that I'm never doing the same thing. Some days I find I'm more focused on doing literature surveys so that I can come up with, okay, what am I seeing? Has anyone done this before? Or is this something that we want to propose? Some days are sitting there working up the data from tests that we've been running. Some are writing reports for the clients that we're working with. Some are overseeing the laboratory work that's going on. And again, some are developing new and novel techniques for characterization or testing. And of course, my favorite part are the meetings. There are some days that are just meetings upon meetings.
A lot
Yeah.
of our listeners might not realize what happens at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. You know, when people hear nuclear energy, they immediately have this vision of Homer Simpson, and that's not necessarily what the work entails. Maybe you could speak a little bit to what happens at the CNL. And I realize that you have signed some non-disclosure agreements, so this might be a little bit of a challenging question. But if you could give us an overview of sort of what really are the opportunities there for people who might be interested in this field.
Yeah, of course. So I also do want to point out too that what I am speaking about and my role at the company is a small role in the company. We have a huge variety of people employed at CNL that work on a variety of different things. So there's also a group that works on targeted alpha therapy, which I think is really interesting. But of course, I'm just a very small section of it. And one of the things that I have been focusing on lately is trying to help to improve reactor safety. So going on to the Homer Simpson kind of analogy too, I think that one of the most recent incidents that people think about when they hear of nuclear is what happened in Fukushima Daiichi back in 2011. They had some issues with their reactor cooling, of course. What we're trying to do is essentially find ways that we can improve on that. So can we actually prolong the amount of time that it takes for the material to degrade at those extremely high conditions? Because normally our reactors are operating at about 300, 350 degrees Celsius. In the Fukushima accident, the reactors actually hit up to 1200 degrees Celsius just because they were not able to, their cooling got shut down. So one of the projects that I have is actually looking at applying coatings onto the fuel cladding. And by applying on this coating, we are not only able to help to extend the lifespan at these accident scenarios, but we're also able to expand the lifespan of these components even under normal reactor conditions. So we're constantly working towards improving the safety of these components. We're constantly working to improve the longevity of these components.
What makes the job so interesting? I mean, obviously you enjoy it, and certainly from what you've just said, there's so much to it. Is there something specific about it that you really thoroughly enjoy?
So beyond the fact that I did mention before that my job is always changing and each day is really different, I really do believe that nuclear science is the way of the future. I really enjoy green and clean energy. And I do truly believe that our research really needs to focus on nuclear energy if we do want to combat climate change, because the other options that are more sustainable to us, like solar power, wind power, geothermal, they're just not fully capable of realizing the energy demands that we have on a day-to-day basis.
Looking back at your educational path, did you encounter any hurdles along the way or any obstacles that you felt may have deterred you from your goals?
So I think that this is something that I was actually really looking forward to talking about with you, because as we all know, unfortunately, there are a lot of stereotypes that people face in school. The very first encounter that I ever had was actually in fourth grade. I had a teacher talk to me specifically and then also talk to my mom on a separate occasion, telling us both outright, and I quote her, that girls are just bad at math. And I remember too that she referred to us as girls. And this was a female teacher that was saying this, and she was the one who was teaching us math. And it's something that has stuck with me for years. I think that I was just lucky because I was resilient enough to go, well, I'm just going to prove this teacher wrong. And I remember too that the reason why she said that was because she had actually marked some questions on my math test wrong. And I had brought that up to her and she said, no, girls are just bad at math. This is your mark and I'm not changing it. And then my mom went up to try to argue with
Wow.
her as well. She said the exact same thing. And then lo and behold, at the next test, now I'm getting 100% on my test. That was my first struggle that I faced with these stereotypes. And then the other really lasting stereotype that I also remember was in high school. I think it was grade 11 when I had my first physics class. And my physics teacher told me essentially the exact same thing. And again, she referred to us as girls, not women, and just said that girls are bad at physics. And this is again another female teacher, someone who's supposed to be empowering us and trying to lead us in the correct direction, just telling us don't even bother because you're just going to be bad at it anyways. And that this is a man's field, that you shouldn't be going into these kind of fields. And I really just sat there and I went, well, I'm going to show you guys, because it's such a harmful stereotype. And I know that I'm not the first person to have been told this, and I know I'm not going to be the last. But really, there's so many bad stereotypes that we see, even beyond just going towards women and them being bad at any of the STEM fields. But I think too that this is also something that is good to bring up, because while times are changing and CNL is doing everything that they can, of course, to employ females, it's still a heavily dominated male industry. We still do see a lot more men in there because you're being put into the stereotypical gender roles of that females are admins and men do the actual testing and the research and everything like that. And actually, if you don't mind, I found this report that got issued back in the 1950s that I thought was kind of interesting,
Go for it.
um, because it said the very first sentence in this report says zirconium, often called the female metal in quotes, because of its unpredictable characteristics.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I agree with you 100%, Caitlin. Again, thinking of my own experience going through school, I remember when we started getting into my college education, my university education, so few of my teachers were actually female. And I found this even shocking when I was doing my biology degree, where most of my teachers were male, and yet I was looking around the classroom, most of them were female. I have friends who went and did their engineering degrees, and they had a very different experience. All of their teachers were male, and yet looking around the room, all of their peers were male. And I think they even joked and said, we have two token girls in our graduating year, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't mean it with any malice. They were saying it as like, this is a problem. This is a problem in science. This is a problem in science related fields. We have so few males in the nursing domain. So it's really interesting that you bring this up. And I think we owe it as educators, myself, I put myself in that lot, that we try to break down those gender barriers, and tell girls, no, you can't do math. And I've had so many students in the past who've come up to me who say, sir, I can't do this. I just can't do math. And I say, what are you talking about? No, you can do it. And you sit down and we get through it, and then they do it. And they're like, thank you. And I'm like, no, you've always been able to do this. It's just you need this belief in self. But they basically recite to me the exact same story that you recited here today.
Yes. And I think that a lot of it too is just a confidence issue because they're always being told that. So they're just going to end up believing it.
What do you think we should be doing differently in terms of getting out to women specifically, that there's a role for them to play in these male dominated fields?
Well, I think that first and foremost, I think that your podcast is really great because you've highlighted women into your podcast in unconventional careers and they're able to actually talk about it and share their experiences. I think too that it really starts from when these children are young. So it comes from not only from the teachers, but also from the parents of trying to make sure that the parents are not enforcing gender stereotypes, that the teachers are not enforcing gender stereotypes, and that they're able to have role models that are completely varied. And like you said, having a male that's a nurse and having a female that's a doctor and that being the norm. Just really trying to make it so that people stop listening to the stereotypes and start believing in themselves and finding the things that they truly enjoy doing, regardless of if it fits that stereotype.
When you were doing your bachelor's, did you encounter any resistance to you being in an engineering program from your peers?
For the most part, I would say no. The majority of my peers in my undergraduate were actually very open and welcoming. And it was the same kind of idea, though, where a lot of the professors were men and the majority of my peers were also men. I think that the biggest thing that I did face, and I even faced this in high school as well, was in group projects where we would be trying to come up with something. I would propose an idea and it would either get completely ignored or shot down. And then a couple minutes later, one of my male peers would repeat the exact same thing that I said. And it would be, oh, that is the perfect idea. We're going to go with that. And that
Oh,
was
excellent.
definitely frustrating. I'd also just like to add to that one of the major contributing factors as well that made me really admire both Dr. McDermott and Dr. Kish was that they really tried to provide equal opportunities to both men and women. So our research group at the time was actually majorly composed of women, whereas a lot of the other research groups were primarily composed of men. And I remember that Dr. McDermott was talking to me one day and he said, I really want to try to avoid the whole stereotype of that women can't be doing this. And I really want to try to push women into these roles and give them as many opportunities as possible. That's something that I will always really, really admire them for.
So, Caitlin, on that note, what advice do you have for students, any student, navigating their career path right now? There's people who are listening, young girls, young men, who are still trying to figure out where they want to maybe go with science. What advice do you have for them moving forward?
So definitely I want to stress again, don't listen to any of those stereotypes. You can do whatever you want to do. It doesn't have to be fitting into what you actually think that you're supposed to be doing. I also really recommend trying to expose yourself to as many career options as possible and not close any of the doors. So if you're really not sure about what you want to do, try to research into different positions. Try to talk to different people. Try to see if there's someone that can actually sit down with you and discuss their career and see if that's something that you would actually do. I also want to stress to trying to find something you actually truly enjoy doing. Don't just settle for something that you're doing because it's the easy route or settling for it because it's something that you've been doing for so long that now you have to stick with it. And I think that one of the other things too that I've also seen is figuring out if you're okay with relocating for a job. Because depending on where you want to live will also kind of dictate job opportunities that are available to you. So, for instance, if you wanted to come and work at CNL, you would have to relocate out here to Chalk River. So, you really need to make sure that you are okay with moving somewhere new and exciting for a job, or if you'd rather live in a major metropolitan area, say like Toronto, try to research what kind of jobs are available there and if those are something that actually interests you.
That's something that often gets understated is that as you begin to specialize in science, oftentimes the opportunities are not where you think they're going to be. I lucked out that I grew up in Montreal. I happened to find a job in Montreal, but also when I got to the end of my degree, I realized there was a very real possibility that I would have to leave Montreal to seek opportunities. It's not every day that somebody's hiring a PhD teacher. I have to go where there's openings, and thankfully I happen to be in a spot at a time where there was huge turnover in CEGEPs for professors. There were so many people retiring, but I look at some of my peers who are going through the system right now, and they're having a much more difficult time finding job stability just because they're on a part-timer status and those tenure track positions are just not available. So I think you raise a very valid point there, Caitlin.
Kind of going off of that too, I remember that when I was applying out for jobs, one of the positions that I got offered was actually a contract position, currently out where I was living near Hamilton. At the same time, I'd also been offered the full-time position at CNL, and I went, well, I think that CNL is probably going to be the more interesting job to go with anyways. And I don't really mind moving out there. It worked out for me that I was willing to move for the job.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin, for giving me the time to talk to you about your experiences in science, your experiences in your educational path, and finally, your wonderful experiences that are happening right now at CNL. Let's do this again sometime. It was nice catching up with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting me today.
And so concludes this episode of the podcast series Careers in Science. I've been your host, Sean Hughes. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe to the page. And if you have suggestions for any other careers you'd like to see profiled in this series, be sure to leave a comment. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.